Joining me now in Lancaster is Simon Mabon. He's a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Center and the director of the spat project, which looks at sectarianism. In Lahore, Iran, is politics lecturer Alam Saleh. He's a council member of the British Society for Middle Eastern Studies. And in Washington, D.C. is Matthew Brodsky, a senior research fellow at the Securities Studies Group. Good to have you all on the program, gentlemen. Simon, the UK sending a third warship to the Gulf, but then saying, oh, no, this was pre-planned. It has nothing to do with Iran. Does anybody buy that?
That's a good question. I think what the UK is trying to do is cover all bases. It's trying to make sure that it contains its presence in the region, that it's got some military capabilities in order to support its own interests in the Gulf. But it also has to do it in a way that doesn't look like it's escalating the situation. It has to do it in a way that it doesn't come across that the UK is trying to increase its military presence as a means of deterring Iran. So it's trying to find whatever way it can to say, look, we are doing what we'd already planned to do, regardless of what had happened in the previous week. Now, the question is, does anyone buy it? I'm not convinced, to be honest, but that's part of the game that we're playing.
Alam Saleh, so the UK trying to flex its muscle, but wearing a heavy coat on top of it and doesn't want to show it. It's trying to do both. Why is it doing this right now?
I think there are two dimensions to explain United Kingdom's actions recently with Iranian tanker in Gibraltar. One is that in the post-Brexit era, London needs them more than ever. And that particular action came after a special request from Washington to drive London into the Middle Eastern games once again, like in 2003, when they have invaded Iraq. And this is particularly comes when Washington really is isolated in its war against Iran. Actually, it's the so-called maximum pressure, and it's in economic war actually, which has begun since 1 year.
Alam, can't it be just the fact that the UK is acting unilaterally here? That they're not Washington's lackey, and they're seeing the Iranians are seizing their tankers, they're seizing the Iranians' tankers, and they're acting on their own behalf without the hand of Washington behind them.
The United Kingdom is no longer an international actor or power. It cannot act by any means in the Middle East in particular, in the Persian Gulf region alone, but when it comes to support or to be supported by United States.
Okay, Matthew Brodsky, it's not the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt then that we should be looking to for answers when it comes to the spat with the Iranians. We should maybe be looking at the Americans, because the UK is an extension of American foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran right now. Is that how you see it?
I would say the Trump administration certainly hopes that that's the case. I mean, for a period now since May of last year, when the Trump administration partially withdrew from the agreement, a lot of time has been spent trying to get Europe on the same page as the administration so that there could be a negotiated new deal that's far more expansive, that deals with its nuclear program, its horrible behavior, and of course its ballistic missiles. But in the meantime, there's still a lot of infighting within our own coalition to be able to, of course, get together and put a united front forward to deal with Iran's increasingly aggressive behavior.
Matthew, the UK is seemingly throwing its lot in with Trump on this and not trying to be more like the other Europeans and saying, hey, maybe we can salvage the deal. Is it making the right choice?
I think so, because the nuclear agreement doesn't work. Iran is cheating now. That part is at least verified by the IAEA. But of course, it's been cheating previously, and we know that. Of course, the whole agreement was designed to allow cheating and to not have any method to push back other than international snapback sanctions. So we need to get to a new agreement. And the way to get there, of course, is to reclaim the leverage that the Obama administration squandered when it put together this deal. Now, in order to do that, so the whole point, I should say, is really to create this level of tension, which means, of course, Iran will lash out, but then to have a negotiation that will deal with the problems I just laid out. To fix the hull of a broken and sinking ship just doesn't make sense. And I'm sure the Trump administration is rather happy to have Britain on board with the U.S. We've always been really strong allies.
Okay, interesting that you used a ship metaphor here, because tensions revolve around ships that have been seized and oil tankers, right? Alam Saleh, Matthew believes that the UK is making the right decision by being firm with the Iranians. Do you agree with that?
I disagree with Matthew, and I would say I would rather consult the International Nuclear Agency, which has verified that Iran and the nuclear deal actually was working, and Iran was committed to the nuclear deal. Even the United Kingdom and London not only verified that the nuclear deal is working, but it's strongly supporting the nuclear deal. However, it's only Trump's personal decision and not even President Trump's administration. Many, or at least several big officials in Washington also disagree with Trump. So I think Trump, I totally agree with the former British ambassador to Washington that it's only Trump's personal decision, which he just only wants to defy what President Obama previously had done. So the nuclear deal was working and is working, and London and Europe and the whole international community supports the nuclear deal. It's only several individuals in Washington and in the region that agree with me.
Alam, the Iranians have hardly sat back and said, we're being treated badly here. They've also now exceeded the enrichment of uranium, the limit that was set under the deal. It's game theory on both sides, isn't it? The Iranians are also pushing sensitive buttons here.
Tehran has very few options open to them if these maximum pressures would continue. They also need some bargaining power, which at least persuade Europe to act more seriously in keeping this agreement, this internationally funded kind of verified agreement alive. Without strong and serious support of Europe and other international powers, this nuclear deal would definitely end with a disastrous consequence.
Simon, there is a power vacuum in the UK right now. There are unsettling moments politically in the corridors of power. With that in mind, is it in Britain's interest to have the spat with the Iranians?
I think what I must do, first of all, is say I agree with Alam about the power and the successes of the nuclear deal. And I must say that as well, that I'm not convinced that the UK is fully behind Washington on this. This is more about the personalities. And I think there are a couple of personalities who've been incredibly outspoken in London about the negative aspects of the deal and wanting to support the United States. But others have been incredibly critical of President Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal. The UK worked incredibly hard to get this nuclear deal off the ground. It worked incredibly hard to get all parties to come to the table and to thrash out a nuclear deal. And that was celebrated by many as a wonderful feat of diplomacy. So there was a great deal of consternation when it was announced that the United States would pull out. Now, I think what we're seeing in the UK is this political vacuum, this political uncertainty stemming from Brexit, stemming from concerns about the new Conservative Party leader and the new Prime Minister. There's a great deal of uncertainty as to what that new Prime Minister would do vis-a-vis Washington. Many, I think, suspect that Boris Johnson, if he was to win, would follow the United States in its policy towards Iran. But that would be to the chagrin of many others who see that diplomacy is actually the way out of international crises rather than unilateral action.
Yeah.
So it is a particularly worrying time right now.
Yeah, Simon, Boris Johnson, expected to be the new Prime Minister, he said that he would not support a war with Iran. He was quite clear and unequivocal on that.
Sure.
But when it comes to Boris, can we read much into that? Or will he switch it up as and when necessary, depending on circumstances?
I think it's very difficult to read anything into Boris. He says whatever he thinks is best for him at that particular moment, which means that there's a real contradictory set of views that he's presented, often in very close succession to one another. So while he said, yes, we will not support a war, and I think he had to say that, in the long run, if he thinks that it's in the best interest for him and perhaps for the country, then I would imagine that the UK would follow the United States. And that would have devastating consequences for the UK, for the United States, for Iran, for the region, and for the world. We do not want a conflict, and diplomacy is the only way out of this, not unilateral action from the United States or from the UK.
Matthew Brodsky, as things stand right now, is anybody in Washington planning for an actual war with Iran?
I think the United States is always ready for every type of contingency. I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. Released photos of its B-52s returning to the region. Those, of course, carry a far larger payload in terms of bombs to send a message to Iran. But, of course, that's not the preferred approach by any stretch of the imagination. And President Trump has shown fairly good restraint when it came to Iran shooting down one of our drones, an expensive drone, over international waters. He didn't follow a lot of advice and strike an attack. And that, of course, is to get Europe again on the side of the United States to deal with reality as it is, which is we have a broken deal that does not work. In just 7 years' time, all the restrictions in the deal wear off, and Iran and the regime there, they're able to enrich uranium pretty much unrestricted. So by definition, the deal itself was not working and didn't address its behavior. So the restraint that Washington has shown is hopefully going to help bring more of our allies on board so we can address the issue, and that's what needs to happen. And in the meantime, we should expect but not accept that Iran is going to continue to lash out as it is. But they shouldn't mistake President Trump's ability to seek out the help of allies as a form of weakness. The U.S. will respond if it needs to militarily.
Alam Saleh, unpack something for me. After the incident in Gibraltar earlier in the month, we had Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, saying that this was piracy by evil Britain. He made sure to mention that Britain was evil. Unpack it for me. Is that just a bit of rhetoric, or should we read more into it?
I think that Tehran has showed that it's so pragmatic and it's so patient. Iran knows it very well that the West, I mean, particularly United States, nor of course United Kingdom, is in a war mood. They are so reluctant to enter the war, any type of war against Iran. Iran is reaching the deterring power to somehow to deter United States from any kind of aggressive action against Iran. Iran knows it very well how to raise the tension, how to prolong this tension in order to put back pressure against United States and its regional allies. Ayatollah Khamenei is a very pragmatic politician in the end of the day. They know it very well, that they are so patient. They are also at the same time showing their strength by targeting an American drone, by somehow threatening American interest in the region. At the same time, they open the doors open to diplomacy.
Matthew Brodsky, in the same way that Bolton perhaps says a few crazy things about destroying the Iranians, but ultimately the system is more pragmatic. Do you accept that the Iranians are also rational actors in this and they're being pragmatic?
Well, look, Iran has made the decision that it will suffer the economic sanctions, and even though it wants relief. From its perspective, the whole game is about keeping the so-called right to enrich uranium on its soil. Now, that's something that the Trump administration recently began to toil with. Again, I said that we only partially withdrew from the agreement. So in May, we canceled 2 of 7 waivers that have to do with Iran's nuclear program. That is actually why there's been a recent spike from Iran's behavior. It's rational in terms of the #1 goal for the regime is to keep its nuclear weapons project going. It's not rational in terms of providing for its people, who of course continue to protest in the street, and it's willing to tank its entire economy in pursuit of nuclear weapons.
As we circle this back to the very beginning, Simon, looking at the UK and what they might be trying to do, we look at the situation with Nazneen Zaghari Ratcliffe, the UK still being unable to get her released from the Iranians. With that in mind, can the UK actually both project strength but still be diplomatic at this moment in time while it's in a period of political weakness?
It can, but it's incredibly difficult to do. It's incredibly difficult to balance that projection of strength when there are all of these domestic uncertainties and there's this domestic precariousness and there's a bunch of concerns about who the leader is going to be and their ideological positions, question about Brexit, questions about the impact of Brexit on British foreign policy, on British economic capabilities. And that sort of relates back to what Alam was saying about the reduced influence of Britain on the world stage. This isn't just a new position. This has been happening pretty much since the end of the Second World War. And a colleague and I wrote a book about the waning influence of Britain since that point. But yet Britain continues to hold a seat on the UN Security Council, and it continues to exert a great deal of influence internationally through its soft power. And it has these reserves that it can draw upon. Now, it's a case of balancing those reserves against the domestic uncertainty and the need to project strength vis-a-vis Iran, but also keep those lines of dialogue open in order to try and facilitate a diplomatic solution to this. And it's got to do that within the context of increasing pressure from the United States and demands from Europe to continue the diplomatic efforts to get a resolution to the Iranian question, whilst also trying to negotiate an exit from Europe. So it's a real complex balancing act. Now, one thing I should just say as well is that Iran is entitled to enrich uranium under the terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1967. It's a signatory. It is thus entitled to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. And that's something that I think is often overlooked in this debate. Now, of course, the JCPOA was designed to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's not entitled to do that. No, it's not entitled to enrich uranium to that level for a nuclear weapon. And that's where cycle. I think that's where the oversight and the JCPOA was actually working quite nicely. It was seen to be working, and there were international efforts to verify that and to say, look, this is working. And the Iranian leadership has repeatedly said, we do not want a nuclear weapon. And so it's difficult to balance that historical commitment, that historical treaty verified by the IAEA to allow Iran to have that peaceful nuclear enrichment, whilst also then simultaneously putting the pressure on from the JCPOA. So it's a difficult balancing act all round.
Okay, gentlemen, I've got to move on. But it's been good to talk to you all. Simon, Alam, and Matthew, talk to you soon.